The dusty Montana wind swept through the small train station, catching Clara's hat and pulling at the hem of her navy blue skirt. She clutched her suitcase tighter, her heart beating fast beneath her corset. Her boots clacked against the wood as she stepped down from the train, blinking against the bright afternoon sun. There, waiting stiffly beside a buckboard, was a man she recognized from the photograph he'd mailed months ago. Thomas, tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of sun and labor. But his expression now held no warmth, only a hard sort of scrutiny. Clara forced a smile and walked toward him, extending her hand. "Mr. Thomas Gaines," he nodded slowly, not taking her hand. His eyes narrowed, drifting over her face, her figure, her graying hair tucked neatly beneath her hat. "You're Clara," he said flatly. "Yes," she said, letting her hand fall back to her side. "It's good to finally meet you. I hope the journey didn't delay." "You didn't say you were older," he interrupted, arms crossed. Clara's smile faltered. "I suppose I didn't think it mattered." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I need a young woman. Someone strong, who can bear children, tend to the stock, carry the household." "I wasn't expecting." He trailed off, but the silence was heavy with disappointment. Clara straightened her shoulders, trying not to let the sting show. "I can work. I've managed a home for years, cared for my sick father until his passing, and—" "It's not about work," he said quickly, almost dismissively. "I had something different in mind." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. She looked around. No one else was waiting, no welcoming faces. Just the wind, and a man who looked past her as though she were a problem to be solved. "I'm sorry," Thomas said after a pause, not unkindly, but without apology either. "I'll leave money at the depot for your return fare. I hope you find what you're looking for." He tipped his hat stiffly, climbed onto his wagon, and with a flick of the reins, rode off. Clara stood still, her hand tightening around the worn handle of her suitcase. The train hissed behind her as it pulled away. Dust rose around her boots, and for a moment, she simply stared at the empty road where Thomas had disappeared. Alone, rejected, not for who she was, but for what she wasn't. She blinked against the sting in her eyes, drew in a slow, shaky breath, and walked toward town. There was no going back just yet. Not until she figured out where, if anywhere, she belonged now. Clara sat alone at a corner table in the small town inn's dining room, the scent of stew and baked bread drifting through the warm air. Her dress was still creased from the train ride, and the weight of rejection clung to her like dust on her hem. The room buzzed softly with conversation, but she didn't hear any of it. Her mind wandered back to the platform, to the look on Thomas's face, not cruel, but so final. The innkeeper's wife, a round, bustling woman named Mabel, had offered her a quiet room and a warm meal. Clara had accepted both with polite gratitude and a forced smile. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, at least, she could sit and pretend for a moment that she still had choices. "Mind if I sit here?" The voice was gentle, male, and close. Clara looked up, startled. A man in his early 40s stood beside her table, a book tucked under one arm. He had kind eyes, graying at the temples, and a soft, almost apologetic smile. "Oh, of course," Clara said, gesturing to the empty seat. He settled across from her without ceremony, placing the book down next to his plate. "You're new in town." She hesitated, unsure whether to explain or retreat into silence. But something in his gaze made her feel safe, not examined. "Just seen." "I am," she said quietly. "Though perhaps not for long." He nodded, glancing briefly toward the window. "Came on the train, didn't you?" "Yes." Another pause. Then he offered his hand across the table. "Samuel Whitaker. I run the bookstore down the street." "Clara Evans." Her handshake was light but steady. "You don't look like someone passing through," he said, his tone thoughtful, not probing. "More like someone who arrived with a purpose." Clara looked down at her folded hands. "I had one." She exhaled slowly, "but it didn't quite unfold the way I imagined." Samuel didn't press. Instead, he gave her a small smile and signaled to Mabel for another bowl. Sometimes that's the best thing that can happen, even if it doesn't feel that way right off. Clara gave a soft, bitter laugh. "Are you in the business of comforting strangers, Mr. Whitaker?" "I'm in the business of stories," he replied easily. "And most good ones begin when something falls apart." She tilted her head. That's a romantic way of seeing things. He shrugged. It's kept me going. A silence settled between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind that felt like the beginning of something, not the absence of it. Clara glanced toward his book. What are you reading? He slid it toward her. Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. She smiled faintly. A man after my own heart. I'll take that as the highest compliment, Samuel said, smiling back. For the first time since stepping off the train, Clara felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet. But something gentler. A quiet wondering. Maybe she wouldn't leave tomorrow after all. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as Clara stepped into the bookstore. The scent of old paper, ink, and polished wood wrapped around her like a shawl. The space was small, intimate, shelves lining every wall and stacked in tidy islands through the center. Light filtered through the front windows in golden streaks, dust motes dancing lazily in the beams. Samuel looked up from behind the counter where he was sorting a pile of ledgers. A smile lit his face, unassuming, warm. You came, he said. Clara smiled shyly, smoothing a curl that had escaped her bonnet. You said you could use some help alphabetizing your disaster of a poetry shelf. He laughed. That was me being polite. It's a full-on mutiny in there. Dickinson's been keeping company with Shakespeare for weeks. She walked in, her steps slow and deliberate. There was still a cautious edge to her movements, like someone unused to being welcomed. But Samuel's presence soothed her. He didn't crowd her with questions or judgments, he simply made space. He handed her a stack of small, cloth-bound volumes. I was hoping you'd come today. There's something restful about having another soul in the shop. Makes the silence feel companionable instead of lonely. Clara took the books and began sorting them gently, her fingertips reverent over the worn spines. I used to shelve books at the parish library as a girl. Back when no one trusted girls with anything but tea and needlepoint. But I snuck poetry between the hymnals. Samuel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A rebel. She gave a small, almost wistful smile. A quiet one. Hours passed unnoticed. They worked side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes not. They shared memories, favorite lines, half-forgotten stanzas. Clara read aloud a passage from Wuthering Heights, her voice low and steady, filling the shop with its haunting beauty. Samuel leaned on the edge of a table, arms crossed, watching her, not just listening to the words, but to her, the way her voice softened at the romantic lines, tightened at the tragic ones. You bring them to life, he said when she paused. Clara lowered the book, her cheeks coloring. They were always alive. I just carry them for a little while. I think they're better in your hands than they ever were in print. She glanced at him, startled by the sincerity in his tone. No man had looked at her like that in years, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with interest. With admiration, the kind that reached beneath the surface. He gestured to the counter. Would you stay for a cup of tea? I've got an old kettle in the back. Might be dusty, but she still works. Clara hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. In the back room, mismatched cups sat on a shelf, and the tea was simple, dandelion and mint. But it felt rich in a way that no expensive porcelain or fine china could match. They sipped in silence, the murmur of pages turning from the shop beyond the only sound. Samuel looked over the rim of his cup. You know, I always thought love came with fire and thunder. Big gestures, grand declarations. But lately, I wonder if it doesn't sound more like this. Tea and chipped cups, shared verses, someone who remembers your favorite line. Clara met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. And who doesn't mind that you've already lived a whole life before them? He didn't look away. That's the best kind of person to fall in love with. Someone who's lived, and loved, and lost, and still finds poetry in the pages. Something soft and certain settled in the space between them. It wasn't a romance born in haste or desperation. It was unfolding, gently, like a flower that had waited until late spring to bloom. And Clara, for the first time in years, felt herself beginning to bloom too. The meadow lay just beyond the ridge, a quiet patch of earth where the tall grasses swayed like dancers and wildflowers painted the ground in strokes of lavender, gold, and pale blue. The sky overhead stretched wide and brilliant, the sun leaning low enough to cast everything in a gentle amber light. Clara followed Samuel up the path, her skirts brushing the stems of wild clover, her heart thudding with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, nervous, alive, expectant. He turned once to smile at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Almost there. I don't mind the walk, Clara replied, catching her breath. It's beautiful. Samuel gestured ahead. That's the point. When they crested the hill, she saw the blanket spread across the grass. A small picnic basket sat on one corner, and 2 tin cups rested beside a bottle of cider. A simple, homemade arrangement, but done with care, the kind of thoughtfulness that couldn't be bought or faked. Clara stood still for a moment, struck not by the effort but by the intention. No one had planned something for her like this in a very long time. Not since her mother's hands had packed lunches with handwritten notes. Not since before life became a series of duties and disappointments. Samuel held out his hand. Come sit. They lowered themselves onto the blanket, the hush of the field embracing them. They ate in quiet harmony, crusty bread, cheese wrapped in cloth, tart apple slices. Now and then, Clara caught him watching her, as if memorizing the way she lifted her cup or laughed under her breath. Finally, as the sun hovered just above the horizon, Samuel reached into the basket and pulled out a small wooden box. Clara looked at it, startled. What's this? He opened it without ceremony. Inside was a simple gold band, warm in the fading light. No stones, no engravings, just a circle, whole and plain. I know we haven't known each other long in the way the world measures time, Samuel began, his voice steady but soft, but I feel like I've known you in ways that go deeper than years. You're not a girl playing at love, and I'm not a man chasing youth. We've lived through ache, through quiet heartbreaks, through years that were more survival than joy. Clara's breath caught, her fingers curling into the blanket. I don't want a bride from an ad, he continued. I want you, not because you came here looking for someone, but because you stayed, because you looked at this small life and didn't turn away. Because when you read, the room feels alive, and when you look at me, I feel worth looking at. She blinked quickly, her vision blurring. I'm not offering a grand adventure, he said. But I am offering you every page we haven't turned yet. And all the quiet mornings between. Clara stared down at the ring. Her heart, once bruised and cautious, felt full, overflowing. She looked back at him, his eyes waiting, open, without pressure. I came here hoping someone might choose me, she said quietly. But you're the first person who made me feel like I get to choose, too. Samuel didn't speak, but the relief in his face said everything. Clara reached out, took the ring from its box, and slipped it onto her finger. Yes, not as a bargain, not as someone bought or rescued, but as a woman who finally knows she's worth loving, and who loves you in return. The breeze stirred around them as if the world itself exhaled. Samuel leaned forward, his hand brushing her cheek. Then let's begin. In the fading light, beneath a sky splashed with the first hints of stars, Clara leaned into a future she had never imagined. One built not from expectation or need, but from the quiet, unwavering truth of being seen, chosen, and cherished. And it was enough, more than enough.